All right, so I just handed all those back. Let's look at 201. So everything should be up to date right now on Canvas. I went back through all the icons up there, any excused absences, if they're running university related things or things that we talked about, should all be built in. If you have any questions over those, please send me an email sooner rather than later if you have any concerns. You've got your exam 1 score that we had with the corrections, and then your exam 2 score as well. So grades on Canvas and the total grade you're seeing should be up to date. Okay. The exam score was average a little low, which I kind of expected maybe it would be. I know that, especially given the time constraint, these exams are a little bit tougher to take in class sometimes. So I curved the exams so that I had the average right around where I wanted it. So the average ended up being right above 70. There's a couple zeros in this class which I had to deal with, people that are technically still enrolled but not didn't take the exam. So I think if I exclude them, the average is right around the 75. Okay. Overall grades in the class, the average grade, mean, median are just like right below an 80, and I think the median is actually just above 80 or right at 80. So as long as you keep up to date, those of you who keep showing up, improving with your IQ grades, right? Missing some classes, if you show up more, that's going to make them average out, right? So it won't hurt you as much. Continue to do well on those homeworks. I go through those, and overall, the average will be pretty good in this class. Okay? I'll get the answer key posted this afternoon. So if you want to, you can go back through, figure out which ones you got wrong. I'll put the exam up there as well. So if you want to go back and rework them, see what the correct answer was, there might be some good practice because this class we'll start looking at different topics, but a lot of this stuff builds on each other. So the better you can understand kind of mistakes you made, probably the better you can do moving forward, and the better you can do on that time. Okay? Any questions from me before we get going here? Yeah. So it won't be cumulative in the sense that it'll be whatever we cover from here to the final. It will be cumulative in the sense that some of the stuff we're going to look at uses things that we've talked about before. One other question, yeah. So not going to do any corrections on this exam. I just kind of did that linear kind of curve to it. Yep. Questions, other questions for getting the material today? Okay. All right. So, let's jump into it. So I have the slides up there on Canvas. They say week 13, so we'll kind of start today, but then it'll kind of be next week's slides as well. Okay. So we left off kind of the new material that wasn't on that last exam. This is what you expected to know for that exam, but for the final, was we're talking about game theory. Right. So we're going to look at some slightly different kind of games in game theory, which are not simultaneous decisions, but we're making sequential decisions, right? So one person is making a decision before the other player. So we're going to solve these using something called backward induction, and really to kind of give a step-by-step of what that actually means. I'll kind of explain it in general terms, but I think seeing examples work through will make backward induction make more sense. So what we're going to do is whoever makes the final decision, we're going to determine what their best response is to each of the person who's making the decision first is going to do. So let's say, for instance, we go back to that game of chicken, but instead of simultaneously deciding which way we're going to go, one person was standing here, decides to go step this way, and then the other person is to make their decision, right? So you're always going to want to go to the opposite side so we can determine what your optimal decision is for both of that person's possible strategies. Once we know the last person, the person who makes the decision last, once we determine what their best responses are, we then see, okay, the person making the decision first, they kind of know ahead of time what the best responses for the player making the decision after them will be, and then we can determine what their best response is. Right? So like I said, I think this will make a little more sense when we work through some examples. Right? So we're going to set up these sequential games, right, where people are making decisions one after the other in what we call a decision tree. So this is like a kind of an age-old example that a lot of economics courses use, but right, if you haven't seen Charlie Brown, right, just go with me here. So one of the running gags is, right, like Lucy sets the football up, he goes to kick it, she pulls it away at the last second, right? He falls, everyone laughs. So there's two decisions that these players can make, right? So the person making the decision first, right, is going to be whether or not either accepts or rejects to kind of run and kick this football, right? Charlie Brown is just deciding he's either run and kick the football, or he's just going to say, forget it and walk away. So he's making that decision, and the second person making the decision is, once he starts running, kick the football, Lucy holding the football can either pull it away at the last second, and he falls down, right? Or she can let him kick the football, but she doesn't like to see him happen, right? So we can start to think through like each of these players' payoffs in all these scenarios and determine what the equilibrium is going to be, right? Or what it should be, I guess, not with the cartoon. So what we'll do is we set up these players' decisions. So we've got the person making the decision first, right, to either run and kick the football or not. We then, underneath that, show the second person, the person making the decision second, what their choices, their strategies are. So here, if Charlie Brown doesn't run to kick the football, I mean, there really is no decision Lucy can make. She can't hold the football away or not. There's just, he's not participating in the game, right? So we know that if he decides to like reject this game running towards the football, nothing's going to happen. So kind of the payoff there we can think about is like 0-0, right? Nobody's worse off, nobody's better off. If he then runs towards the football to kick it, we then say, okay, Lucy has two decisions to make. If she lets him kick the football, she's not amused, and she feels like this is like a negative, it is a cost, right? Not getting any benefit from this. However, if she pulls it away last second, she gets some type of internal like positive feeling. She likes to see him fall. And so given the choice, for her, the payoff is always greater to pull the football away last second, right? So we determine what the person making the decision second, what their best response or what their optimal decision is going to be. So we just did that for Lucy, and that's to pull the ball away. Well, if Charlie Brown was smart, right? He knows these payoffs. He knows that Lucy enjoys to see him miss this football or fall, right? And so he says, well, if I accept, I know that she's always going to choose to pull that football away. Right? So I know that if I choose to accept this game, I run towards the football, my payoff is always going to be that I fall down, right, and have some embarrassment, right? Some negative benefit. If I do nothing, my benefit is 0. So what's better? Just to do nothing, right? So given the person making the decision second, their optimal choice, we then determine what the first person making the decision, their optimal choice is going to be. So what the equilibrium should be in this case is that we always see Charlie Brown rejecting to run and take the football. Now, obviously, the cartoons are really trying to make kids laugh and things like that, but that would be how we would walk through and solve a game like that. First, determine the person making the decision last, what their optimal choices are. Then going back and given those optimal choices by the person making the decision second, what's the optimal decision for the person making the decision first? So let's use a slightly more economic example here, right? Let's say that we've got a monopoly, okay? And we're thinking about a new firm is entering this market, right? So like new guys, there's a computer market, there's going to be some new company who's going to try to step into the computer market or PC market here, and they're all kind of both setting, once that second firm decides to join that market, we then have the existing monopoly, they can choose what price they're going to set. So they can either set kind of this perfectly competitive price, which we know is going to be higher or lower than the monopoly price. Lower, right? Perfectly competitive price, more competition drives the prices down. The whole point of having monopoly power was to be able to kind of set this price higher and increase profits. The problem is, if the monopolist sets the monopoly price now, that means there's positive economic profits that might incentivize another firm to enter the market. If that firm enters the market, right, what's going to happen is because the monopolists set their prices high, if that new firm kind of undercuts them, right? Then that new firm could potentially have positive profits while the existing monopoly kind of loses out a lot of business, right? Because they were setting this price at the monopoly level. If instead that firm who was thinking about joining the market decides to stay out, well, they stay out, their profits are zero, and the monopoly still enjoys their positive profits from having this higher price. So those are kind of our combinations of strategies, right? The monopolist could set monopoly price. The other firm thinking about entering could then enter or stay out. They could also, the monopolist could set a lower, more competitive price. Now, if that firm decides to enter at this lower price, they're both going to be setting kind of the equilibrium, perfectly competitive price, and there isn't enough profits. Sorry, there isn't enough demand for them both to enjoy profits. So this is the idea of maybe this was like a natural monopoly, right? If we truly were setting the price equal to marginal cost, it's not enough to support two firms, right? They're both setting kind of that perfectly competitive price, they both get negative profits here. However, if the monopolist sets the competitive price and the firm thinking about entering the market stays out, well, if they set the price at the perfectly competitive price, we know that in a perfectly competitive market, profits in the long run are zero. So profits are zero. And the firm that stayed out, their profits are zero as well, right? Because they didn't enter the market. So the way we solve this is we go to who's making the decision second. So the monopolist is setting the price first, and then this other firm is deciding, should I enter the market or not? So we'll make decide what the person making the decision second, this entering firm, what their optimal choice is. So if the monopolist sets a competitive price, what is optimal for this firm thinking about entering to do? Yeah, if they enter and the monopolist set a competitive price, they get negative profits. If they just stay out, their profits are zero. So we would say kind of their optimal choice is to stay out here. What if the monopolist, actually, right? So stay out. I kind of already hit here, but if the monopolist instead set a high monopoly price, then what's optimal for that firm to do? Well, if they enter that market and undercut the monopolist just a little bit, they can get positive profits. If they stay out, the profits are zero. So they're going to choose to enter the market if the monopolist set up a high price, right, or the monopoly price. Any questions on that? So you go through, right? That monopolist making the decision first has two decisions they can make. They can set the monopoly price or the competitive price. For each of those decisions, you determine what's the person, this entering firm, the person making the decision second, what's optimal for them to do under both those scenarios. We see here that if the monopolist set a competitive price, that firm should stay out. If the monopolist set a high monopoly price, that firm should enter. So knowing this, right, or looking at these payoffs, the monopolist can figure out, well, this is what would be optimal for that entering firm to do. So if I set a monopoly price, what's the monopolist payoff? Well, I know if I set a monopoly price, that firm will always enter. So I'm going to end up with negative profits. If I set a competitive price, I know that firm will always stay out and my profits will be zero. Right? So what's optimal for the monopolist to do? Well, negative profits are worse than zero. All right, so they'll decide to set the competitive price. So we would say here that equilibrium is going to be that the monopolist sets a competitive price and this firm thinking about entering stays out. Now, it's kind of interesting here is that we can see that even if a firm had monopoly power, potentially just the threat of a firm entering, right, as long as decisions were kind of made sequentially, could actually force monopolists to kind of lower their price down to that perfectly competitive level. So just the threat, if there's no barriers to entry, we allow firms to enter and exit this market, that just the threat of a firm entering could keep the monopolist setting kind of a lower price than what we would expect a monopolist to do. Which is good for society, good for us, hard for us consumers, right? We pay lower prices. Questions on this? Hopefully seeing some more examples will start to make a little more sense. So here I've got rock, paper, scissors. But like, let's say, and this is going to seem really stupid, right? But it's a good example, and everyone, I think most people know of this game. So I'm using this as an example. Let's say instead of throwing rock, paper, scissors at the same time, one person throws theirs first, and then the other person is to respond. Well, we kind of know this is going to be a very interesting game in the sense that whoever makes the decision second is always going to win. Right? because they can always best respond to whatever that first person does. So let's just think through though if we set this up in a sequential game. So the first person can throw rock, paper, or scissors. So they've got 3 strategies now. When we have a sequential game, these extensive form games, we don't have to just, I won't just restrict them to 2 decisions. Potentially we can have more. So the first person can throw rock, paper, or scissors. And then we can think about what the second person's best response to each one of those would be. Well, if the first person throws rock, what's it optimal for the second person to do? Well, if they throw paper, and what is the second player's payoff? Is in the second here? They win, so we'll kind of indicate that with a 1. If they throw rock, right, it's a tie, so 0. If they throw scissors, rock would be scissors, so they get a payoff negative. If the first person throws rock, the player 2, the optimal thing to do would then be to throw paper. First person throws paper, the same sort of thing. The optimal first thing the second person to do, so they're going to throw whatever allows them to win. So they throw scissors and win. First person throws scissors. The optimal thing the player 2 to do would be to throw rock, and scissors. Right, so we can determine the best response for player 2. Now, for player 1 here, we kind of have a weird scenario where if I look at my payoffs in all of these scenarios, it's always going to be -1, -1, -1. So here's actually a weird extensive form game we can see because player 2 can always optimally respond if we set this up as a sequential game. For player 1, there's really no optimal choice. No matter what decision they choose, they're always going to end up losing here. And that kind of makes sense in the context of a rock, paper, scissors game. If you know, first person, if you don't go sequential, or if you don't go simultaneously, it's not a very interesting game, right? And so this would be one where we say there's really no Nash equilibrium, right? Because we look at those payoffs, and they're always going to be -1 for that first player. Just starting to hopefully make a little more sense. So I'll go through one more example of these extensive form games. So let's say that you're given $100 to share with someone. So like if I choose 2 of you and say, hey, here's a $100 bill, you get to determine how much you want to share with the other person. Once you kind of offer a certain amount to that person, right, you can do it in $1 increments. We can't do this like in pennies, right? But I could give you $1, keep 99. I can give you $2, I keep 98, right? And the only way that I get to keep the amount that I gave you 2, the only way I get to keep 98 is if you accept the offer. So I'm kind of thinking about setting this up as a normal form game, right? The first person makes the decision how much to give the other or offer the other person. And the second person makes the decision, do I accept this offer or not? So really, this is like any bargaining that we're really thinking about. So we've got the first person. Right? What's the lowest amount they could offer this person? Yeah, $0. In which case, person 2 here, actually, sorry. So they could give that person $0. In which case, if the person accepts it or rejects it, right, that's their 2 decisions. If they accept the offer, then player 1 keeps $100, player 2 gets 0. If they reject that offer, they both get 0, right? No one gets to keep any of the offer. So we then can start to think, okay, what's the next amount? Well, they could offer $1 to player 2. They can accept or reject. If they accept this offer, player 1 gets 99, player 2 gets $1. If they reject, both people get 0. We then do, okay, what if they offer $2? Person 2 can accept or reject. They offer $2 and it's accepted. Player 1 keeps 98, player 2 gets $2, it's rejected, it both get 0. We can then keep drawing, right, this out for every single dollar amount. But just having these, we can actually determine what the equilibrium of this game is going to be. So we first start out, who's making the decision? Second, it's going to be person 2, do I accept or reject the offer, right? So if player 1 offers them $0, what is optimal for player 2 to do? Well, here they're actually indifferent between these two decisions, right? Either way, they get $0. What if they offer player one, sorry, if player one offers player two $1? What's optimal for player two to do? Well, accepting that offer is better than not, right? At least I'm walking away with $1 as opposed to 0. What if they're offered 2? Same kind of thing. Well, having $2 is better than 0. So player one knows that as long as they're offering some $1 or higher, it would always be optimal. If we're just talking purely monetarily, right? It would always be optimal for player two to accept the offer. Now, they don't know that if they offer them nothing, right? Because here, if I'm indifferent between accepting and rejecting, we don't know what that second player is really going to do. They're the same, they're just as well off either way. So we would kind of say the equilibrium then would be for player one to offer $1. They know that if the other person only cares about money, they'll always accept it because $1 is better than 0, right? And for player two, or for player one, why would I offer player two $2? Because if I do that, my payoff's going to be low. If I offer them anything higher, I know that they're always going to accept it. Well, I'm just giving them more money is just kind of taking money away from what I get. So we would say highest payoffs exist here, where player one offers $1, player two gives it. Now, at this scenario, potentially player one can end up with $100, but they don't know that for sure, right? Because player two here is indifferent between those payoffs. They're both zero. Questions on that? Just if it's starting to make sense how we kind of go through and solve these extensive point games.
I was assuming that those people were aware of the stipulations and each wanted to maximize what they could gain. So I thought that they would prove it first.
So if this person, I mean, we could build in a more complicated model where, right? Yeah, maybe the second person says, I'm not. Well, let's actually think through this. So
wouldn't that just be 50-50, right?
So let's think through this stuff. So we would try to do that. Let's say player two comes to player one and says, look, I know that this long run equilibrium is for you to offer me anything just above 0. You can even offer me a penny, like I know that that's how you're going to do it, right? So he says, I'll tell you right away, I'm going to reject any offer below $50. If you don't split this evenly with me, I'm rejecting every value below that. Well, player one looks at that and says, that's not a credible threat. Because I know if I offer you $1, why would you just reject it? You just don't want the $1, you're just going to walk away with nothing?
Well, if the person, I thought that the final bullet said nobody gets anything.
So no one gets anything if they can't agree, right? Well, if the player one offered, so let's say I offered you, like we're talking, and you know that I can split this with you, it's $100. And you say, I'm not going to accept anything over 50. And I say, okay, I'm going to offer you $1. You accept it or reject it. If you reject it, you walk away with nothing. You accept it, at least you get $1. So I know.
But because you didn't do what I said, wouldn't I not let you have that 99?
So this is where the game can get a little more interesting. If it's purely based off money, your threat is incredible. Right? If you'll say, it's kind of weird to think about, like you don't care about anything else, no emotions, right? All you care about is just having, increasing your wealth, right? Then I know your threat's not credible because I know as long as I offer you $1, you're better off than if you rejected my offer. Now, where this game will start to get interesting, I think I've got a couple bullets maybe up here. No, we'll just talk. I think I just want to talk through it because it does get interesting. Let's say that if I know that you're splitting $100 with me and you offer me $1, son of a bitch, right? Like this is not fair. So you can start to build in. If you offer me a value of $1, yeah, I'll have that $1. But like, let's say that there's this additional cost. Like, I feel like the inequality of it has like psychic costs on it, right? It's hard to put our emotions in a dollar amount, but we really do make decisions like based off that. So let's say you offer me $1. I'm so disgusted with like your inequity that it's actually internally, it feels like a negative $10 cost, right? So then the payoff instead would be actually -9, And I know that you'll actually reject it. Because you value equality so much that it disgusts you that they only gave you $1. Right? In fact, maybe you enjoy equality so much, right, that it costs you the feeling of them evenly splitting with. So then what happens? Instead of $1, this becomes -49. The optimal decision is to reject. They offer you $2, you still discuss it because they didn't evenly share it. So you have this like additional cost of -50. So you'll reject that.
On what the question specifies the person's beliefs are.
Yeah, so if you're like, if I'm asking you, it's like an examiner question, you'll be told what these payoffs are, right? We started out a scenario where the payoffs are purely monetary. No one has no one is building in feelings of disgust or equality, but you could. And if you do this, where does the equilibrium go? Well, now I look at this. If I'm player one, I say, well, if I offer nothing, I don't know if they'll accept or reject. In fact, now I do know, right? They'll be so disgusted that you offer nothing, they'll automatically reject that spike. Well, what about here? Once again, they're feeling like this is a slight on them. It's having this huge internal cost. They'll actually reject out a spike here. This would go all the way up to until we get to them offering that person $50. Now, if they can choose to accept or reject, well, if they reject, it's still 0-0. Now, when I get to $50, right, -50, 0. Now, like your player two is getting $50 in their pocket here, right? But it has to be that their decision is, okay, I have this money, but like I had this huge cost as long as you didn't evenly split it. As soon as you evenly split it, that -50, like my feeling of disgust or spite towards you goes away. Now we're back up to 50-50. Now I know that player two. So then, if I know that you're a spiteful person, it's not so spiteful, right? That you really value equality, you highly value equality. When there isn't equality, it's this huge internal cost to you. Then the optimal decision for player one would be to actually offer you the even split. Yeah. So like, yeah, do this in practice. So this is actually really interesting. So this is one of the things I was going to bring up. I wasn't going to go quite to the even split. That's a really good way to think about it, right? That if you offer me anything below an even split, there's this huge internal cost to me. I would reject everything. As soon as you offer me an even split, I guess anything higher, right? Then that cost goes away because now I feel like we're equal, right? I don't have this huge negative internal feeling towards you. What happens in practice? So we don't have one here. Well, we kind of run one here, although it's hard to get funding to do things like this. But there are certain universities that have economic experimental labs, right? And so they actually will get funding and then have participants come in and they'll run experiments like this. I don't know if they've ever done it with as high of $100. Usually they're playing around like $20 or something like that. And what they found is that if you were to like, I remember the percentage, but if you were to take their payoffs and like scale them up to $100, what they find in practice is that when people are given this scenario, that most of the time the equilibrium ends up being, I think it was like around 20%. So about $20 is the offer that the person makes, because they know that if they make offers too low, people will just out of spite, they actually put like a benefit to spiting that person, but they'll reject those really, really low offers. And they also know that like, well, I don't want to offer 50-50 because I probably could offer 40-60 and they'd still take that. And what they actually find the equilibrium is somewhere around like that 20 to 25% range. So if I give you about a fifth or a fourth of whatever this amount is, then you start to see people, they don't feel like it's too unequal. They don't start to act out of spite. They'll actually take the offer.
The second person in this have unbelievably unfair advantage in this though. Because like if you're aware of the situation, your best option would be 99-1. Well, then the first person would just not offer.
So the person who actually has, if it's purely, so let's go back, scale back. If it's purely based off money, and we said we need the equilibrium, I was going to do they offer them $1. Yeah, it's actually really beneficial to be the first person to speak, right? Because you're getting to, because you know what that player two will do. Now, if we build that spike in,
but if you're player two and your entire basis is financial gain, you're going to want to gain as much as possible. knowing that they're not going to, I mean,
But if I know, if we go back to the original payoffs, right? We said that if I offer you anything, all you care about is money, you'll always accept my offer. Because you'll always be better off accepting my offer. And I know that ahead of time.
would you be more beneficial to accept a higher offer?
Yeah, it is, but we're making the decision second. You don't get to determine how much I'm offering, right? Player one is getting to choose how much they offer player two.
But wouldn't that be based on the fact that player one wouldn't player one's idea be making more money also?
Yeah. So if I offer you $1 and all you care about is money, you're going to accept it because one's better than zero. I want to make as much money as possible. I'm not sure what you do if I offer you zero, right? You could accept or reject. I'm not sure. So the safe bet for me is I know that if I offer you $1, I get to keep the remaining 99. So why would I offer you anything higher? So, I mean, I guess if we're purely talking monetarily, right, this actually is a huge benefit to a person, right? Because I know that anything above zero is better off for you. So I always know you're not going to reject my offer, right? So in knowing that, I'm going to offer you the smallest amount possible. In fact, this is like what a lot of companies, this is what employers do, right? You can think about this in terms of wages. When economic conditions get really poor, right? I know that I can offer lower wages and people will accept it because having a low wage is better than having zero wage, right? So I can kind of get away with giving people a lower wage because I know they'll always choose to accept it as opposed to be unemployed, right? And I'm kind of assuming away a lot of things that like there are other positions or something like that, but the same sort of principles will apply, right? That if I don't accept the job offer, my payoff is zero. If I accept it, at least it's something positive. So I know these are tough, right? Especially like this one is a hard one to get your mind around because you know that people don't purely make decisions based off of just money, right? There's feelings of spite, there's feelings of equity. But I think it's an interesting example of thinking. Like I said, they've run this experiment and they kind of find that, yeah, people wish the person who I'm telling, you can split it, right? They would love to offer zero and walk away with 100, right? But they realize that that causes negative feelings in the other person, and that they have to offer at least something that doesn't make them feel completely slighted. Where are we at? Okay. So, we could probably run with these types of examples for classes, right? I'm gonna stop here. We'll revisit these at some point. As we bring up other topics, we'll start to then put those into what look like extensive form games. So the next topic we're going to talk about are externalities. Right? So externalities are any additional cost or any additional benefit to someone other than the producers and consumers in that market. Okay? So if I think about like the production of electricity from a coal power plant, there are benefits to the consumers of that electricity, there are benefits to the producers, but there's also this additional cost, right? There's additional cost to someone who's not even using the electricity produced, right? Which is that there's all this pollution, right? So, there's a couple, I think LA is a pretty good example, but there's a lot of Shanghai in China, where the pollution is just so bad that there's days that people can't go outside. Right?
Shanghai is one Hong Kong.
Yeah, so there's actually, that's probably a couple of examples from China, because one of the main things is up until recently, and there's some program where there was like these things called scrubbers on coal plants, and there was no regulation with coal plants in China had to use them, so they were like literally just pouring out soot into the air. So now they've started kind of enforcing that you have to have scrubbers if you use this coal plant. Anyways, that's a tangent, right? But this idea is that they're producing this pollution, which are having costs to other people that aren't even involved in the market. So we would call that a negative externality. So we also have positive externalities, right? We can think about a pretty relevant one right now is immunizations, right? Or vaccines. Like I actually used to use this example pre-COVID. I used to think of it more so like polio and things like that. But the idea is, there are costs and benefits to people making vaccines or immunizations and the people getting them. But there's also additional benefits to all the people around them because it's less likely now that whatever disease we're looking at, the people around them get the disease, right? So there are benefits to the producers and consumers of vaccines, but there's also additional benefits even to those people who decide not to consume it. Right? This is actually, I think, the idea of herd immunity, right? You get up to a certain level, even if 20% of the population doesn't have that vaccine or immunization, well, it doesn't matter because you kind of wiped it out enough to where it won't spread. It's way less likely they get it, right? So there's huge positive externalities. Education is another really good example, right? When it comes to like getting your college degree, right? It's kind of weird there, but like the producers are actually universities, right? So there's some benefits to the universities of you pursuing a college degree. Obviously, you're paying a decent amount of money to be here. There's also benefits to you because the whole idea is that you can increase your lifetime earnings. Like if we're boiling it down to like lifetime earnings, and maybe like there's a value of also increasing your intelligence or your knowledge. But there's also benefits to the rest of society. There's benefits to you attending a university, getting your college degree, because you're now a more productive member of society. You can increase innovation, right? You're increasing productivity. Which, what if you go to university leads to you inventing some product that has this huge benefit on everybody's life, right? So there's huge positive externalities to education. People that aren't even involved in the education market, they're not going to college, they're not, they aren't in the university, right? They still benefit from you attending college. I think some other negative externalities you can think about. Smoking is always a good one too, right? There's benefits and costs to the producers and consumers of smoking. But if I'm not a smoker and I'm standing next to you, there's a huge negative externality to me. Right? I don't enjoy breathing cigarette smoke from someone. Right? So, maybe you do. Right? Maybe this is an individual specific one. Right? I guess it depends on what kind of smoke. Right? So we've got negative and positive externalities, and we'll think about, well, then if the market's only making the decision based off the consumers and producers' cost and benefits, maybe they're doing something that's actually worse for society or not optimal for society. Right? We've already seen this. If you let producers and consumers decide the optimal amount of pollution, they decide an amount of pollution that's way too high, right? So how can we think about these models? So I think the first one I think I'll go ahead and I'm going to pull off on the slide and just try to draw this. So let's start to think about our old supply and demand model and build in the first one we'll look at. I think it's easier to think about negative externalities, right? Or these additional costs to society. So we could use pollution as like the easiest example. So we've got the production of some good. We've got our supply and demand curves, right? We can determine where that equilibrium price and quantity will be. Hopefully this is like pretty good, easy at this point. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we said that the supply curve reflects the marginal costs of every producer in this market, and the demand curve reflects the marginal benefits to every consumer in this market. So if they're making a decision, they're gonna, it's gonna end up in the long run at this equilibrium point. This is the quantity, this is the price. What would total surplus look like? Well, we can think about consumer surplus was just how much people benefit between how much this good costs them. So here's our consumer surplus, producer surplus, how much they're benefiting, like they're receiving the price, and how much it's costing them, right? So we kind of had, this was our total surplus here. Now let's think about if there was negative externality in this market. Okay? So if there's negative externalities, what we're really saying is there's additional costs. We're thinking about the production of this good has the additional cost to society of pollution. So maybe this is electric power from the coal plant. So what that means is that every quantity there is not just the cost to the producers, but there's also this additional cost to society, right? So for society, we call kind of, I shorthand it with this. We'll see in a couple seconds. When you think about, no, I know what it is. I shorthand this one. So the marginal cost to society, or the marginal society cost, right, is going to be actually higher than the companies, right? Because it'll include both the company's cost, but also the additional cost to people living in that country from this pollution that's created. Okay? So it's almost like we see kind of this decrease in supply. Now, the actual supply curve hasn't moved at all, right? It's just that if we were basing this off of what's best for society, society's cost curve would kind of be shifted to the left there, right? Or think about it differently, it reflects that at every quantity produced of electricity, there's additional cost to society of the costs that are incurred by pollution. I forget what some of the numbers are, but like you can, they've put it in dollar amounts like pollution, air pollution, the cost from things like asthma and other respiratory related diseases, right? You can actually put some dollar amounts on this if you have historical data. Okay? So if we're thinking about society here, where would they find it optimal for the quantity and price of electric power to be? Now, you know, electric power, maybe we're measuring this in like kilowatt hours, some kilowatt units or something like that, for exactly how they measure that. So the way we determine where society wants the equilibrium to be is based off of society's costs. And if there's no like positive externalities here, then the marginal benefits to consumers just reflect the marginal social benefits as well. So there's no positive externalities, so we don't have any kind of differences in the benefits. There's no additional benefits to society, so the benefits to consumers represent the benefits to society. If we have negative externalities, the cost to producers don't reflect all the costs of society, right? Because they're not factored in the pollution. So now we've got, for society, the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost at this point. So here, society would actually, I'm going to call this equilibrium quantity where society would want it to be, and equilibrium price that if society was making the decision, right, factoring in all of the costs of production of this good, would actually be a lower quantity and they would be setting a higher price. So I'm trying to think about here, what was, I guess, about the deadweight loss that was being created in this negative externality, was that for society, we actually want the quantity to be here. So we have overproduction of this good. Right? If we don't factor in the cost of pollution, then the producers and consumers end up overproducing this good. And for every unit that is produced above the socially efficient kind of point, the actual costs, the difference between the actual cost to society and the actual benefits to society will be the difference between our marginal social costs and our marginal social benefits. So this is where society would choose the optimal quantity to be. But if we just allow the producers and consumers in this market to make the decision, they are producing too much. And so we end up with all of these additional costs, which was represented by deadweight loss, relative to the point that if we allowed society to make the decision. So for the negative externality, we can kind of say a couple things, right? So quantity that the market kind of lands on is going to be too high, and the price is going to be set too low. And that's because basically free market ignored these additional costs to society, right? They ignored the cost of this pollution because they didn't have to pay for it. They don't have to pay for your inhaler. They don't have to pay for whatever your respiratory, disease hospital bill is. Oops. Okay. Questions over anything there?
Surplus, maybe it's just a diagram.
It's hard.
Spending more of consumer surplus, but I don't know if that's just.
So it's hard to think about where all these surpluses overlap. That's why I can draw them all up here. If you think about with society, right, there's back. So think about it this way. If I just allow this market to arrive at that higher quantity, there are costs to society from the pollution, but also having that higher quantity, there is benefits. It's offset by benefits to both producers and consumers. So there is like some areas in here that would like overlap. That the overproduction here, like this surplus here, it's an additional cost, but it's also an additional benefit now. And so they kind of cancel each other out, right? So the only actual added kind of cost would be that difference between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost. We'll kind of revisit this next class. Just like yeah.
When you have like two different
Yeah, so you're jumping ahead, but we'll get to that next week. So we've got negative externalities here. We've determined that we've got negative externalities. You see this overproduced, the good is overproduced, and the price is set too low. We'll talk about positive externalities on Monday, and then we'll talk about what if we have both of them at the same time. Kind of just, they're going to be really similar to like shifts in supply, shifts in demand, simultaneous shifts. All right. So, if you came in late, didn't get your Scantron, get that on your way out. I will post the answer key when I'm going to teaching in about an hour or so. Other than that, before you leave, you all showed up on the day after the exam and on Friday. Kind of give you a 10 out of 10 today. So make sure you kind of respond with your eye clicker before you leave. Okay. All right, you guys have a good weekend. Stay safe. I will see you on Monday.
Get your example now.
Yeah, I know it's hard to wrap your head around.
I know. It's just so.
It's counterintuitive to how we act.
Unfortunately, I mean, it's just, yeah, because I mean, it's just.
Yeah, I know.
Literally no other factor whatsoever.
Oh. Yeah, send me an email. Thank you.
Just whatsoever.
Yeah, there's which is always interesting. So like those so I went to grad school at Purdue and they have a huge experimental economics lab. And you always start out with your theory, right? And the equilibrium that the theory predicts, but you know that human behavior, you're not going to get there. So you run these experiments to see, okay, we know what the equilibrium should be. If we can figure out where it stops, we can basically tell you on average, how much do people value spike? Right? Because we know where it should be.
But doesn't it, I mean, aren't there like plenty of factors of the relationship between people?
Oh, right, yeah.
That's how you build it.
I was going to say, we're purely talking about two people who, we're purely talking about two people who don't know each other.
Yeah.
Right?
If you offer 50, then you're sold.
We'll also